that I'm not with someone for a few months and then I find the next person for 5 months. This idea of like freedom and having all your options open and not being tied to anything feels to me like chaos. Like you're not actually structuring your life in a way that gives you any meaning. You don't have anything that you're putting any hope into. You're not committed to each other. You have no commitments to anyone. And that's not a life of freedom to me. That's a life that's empty of meaning. In this Debate by Proxy episode, we'll be tackling the topic of marriage. It'll feature one clip from Jordan Peterson and the Whatever podcast, one of the panels there in which Amala Ekpunobi from PragerU was one of the guests. I want to be very clear here. The purpose of this episode is not to say you should get married, although I am a pretty pro-marriage person. The question that we actually want to answer is there even any utility, any use, any value in the institution of marriage? And we can treat it as a social and a legal institution. We'll even completely discount the religious arguments for it. Now, I already know that the majority of the comments on this video are probably going to be along the lines of marriage is stacked against men. Women are incentivized to divorce. The way that the court system works right now is really unfortunate for men. Men stand to lose a lot more than they stand to gain. And yes, I completely understand where all of those are coming from. I don't disagree with any of those. Actually, I am completely on the side of the people making these points as well. I totally understand how hard the experience of divorce can be on men. And that is one of the topics that we will talk about in this video. So stay tuned. Our first clip is going to be from the Whatever podcast.
You said you don't want to get married. Why don't we start with you? Why don't you want to get married?
For me, it's just the foundation of marriage is a religious one, and I'm not a particularly religious person. And as far as where religion or marriage applies today, it's pretty symbolic. It's a piece of paper and a trip to the courthouse, and I don't find it necessary. It may become necessary in life for taxes and healthcare and dealing with children and properties, but just foundationally, I don't think it's the most important thing. Real commitment comes from that relationship that you share with your partner, kids, communication, and what you've both decided is real. That piece of paper doesn't really do much, in my opinion.
You also don't necessarily need to do the whole courthouse license thing to be married and have a ceremony and do your own thing on I understand the whole religious side too. And for me and my fiance, for example, we're not even sure if we're gonna actually legally get married just because the government honestly owns your marriage at that point, and it's just a lot of technical crap. I don't know. We may though, just because it does kind of help with taxes and a lot of other stuff. I don't know, but regardless though, that's why he and I already kind of feel like we're married, because the piece of paper doesn't necessarily matter either. But I do understand where you're coming from, because it is a lot of I don't know, the government has control of, the courts have control of your marriage. They basically own it at that point, and it's not really what marriage is about. It's about a union of two people, really.
I 100% agree. The government involvement is very strange to me, but also I do think the institution of marriage does allow you to safeguard yourself, say if you need a prenup, and that's important for some women.
They make 2 points that I'll pick up on. The first one is this idea that marriage is just a piece of paper and it doesn't change anything about your commitment to each other. And the second one is this angle of the government involvement. Now, when it comes to marriage as a piece of paper, honestly, full disclosure, I was 100% in agreement with Amala here, let's say about 5 years ago, when I was about her age as well. So in general, I completely get where she's coming from. I spent a very, very long time living with my boyfriend before he became my husband, before we finally decided to get married and moved on. And I would actually kind of agree fundamentally, getting married does not change anything about your relationship directly. So if you are equally as committed to each other, and you've already been living together, you kind of treat yourselves as married already, and everyone in your life already knows you as a unit, then actually the act of getting married itself does not change very much in that context. What is different, though, and what I perceive to be very, very different, is how other people who maybe don't know you that well respond to you. And so, for example, if you just hear the difference between saying, my husband and I did this, or my boyfriend and I did this, for whatever reason, my perception was completely changed after I got married, and I realized that people perceive my relationship completely differently if I say my husband versus when I say my boyfriend. And what that means to me, what that says to me, is that there is still a social value in the concept of marriage. People around you, especially people who, like I said, they don't know you that well, so it's not that they've always known you as having been in this relationship and they understand that you're serious about each other and so on. But generally speaking, colleagues, for example, in the context of work, if you're talking about having a husband versus having a boyfriend, people just respond to you differently. They take that much more seriously. And what does that actually mean in practice? Maybe not very much. It's just this idea that I understand that everyone around me knows that marriage means more than just living together and being committed to each other without that piece of paper. But yes, does the actual marriage ceremony change how you engage with each other, change what your relationship looks like on a day-to-day basis? No. And maybe that's a shame, like maybe on some level it should, but honestly, I don't think it needs to at all. I think for me, the value in getting married was completely on this social level and completely on the legal level. And I find it interesting that this perception of there being legal advantages to getting married is treated as though the government now owns part of your marriage. And I don't think that that's how it is at all. That actually is a very strange conceptualization for me personally. It has nothing to do with the government owning part of it. It has something to do with the government is the only enforcer of laws, is the only higher authority that people who are not religious are kind of beholden to in some kind of way. And it sucks. I agree. I don't believe in the government either. I don't think that government should be involved in, regulating the minutiae of my life. I agree with all of that, but I completely get the point of saying marriage is not just something between me and my husband. Marriage is actually, it's a societal thing. And society, unfortunately, is part of, the government is part of that. You cannot say we, on a societal level, commit to each other and everyone in our community can see that and we're all beholden to that, but the government is then suddenly extracted from that. Unfortunately, this is not the society in which we live in. And so fundamentally, marriage is not a union for you and your husband, or for you, for you and your wife, from the other side of it, but it is there as an institution that fundamentally actually safeguards children. And I know we've kind of moved away from that a lot because now it's completely acceptable for people to have kids without being married. But having that sense of commitment and having that commitment nested in a broader society and having rules that regulate how that commitment should work is all actually there to protect kids who are then born as a result of that union. Let's hear from Jordan Peterson on the same topics.
Often say something like, well, we don't need a piece of paper to indicate our commitment to each other, which sounds all revolutionary and Che Guevara, but which is really a pretty pathetic bit of reasoning. First of all, for someone to say that means they think that what they just said convinces you that all marriage is a piece of paper. And that's a preposterously foolish argument. I mean, at minimum, in the typical marriage ceremony, you make a vow by whatever is holy to you, or at least in front of the state itself, and then in front of your community as you define it, that you're going to make a commitment to someone. And if you think that's nothing, then you're probably the sort of person that the person you asked to marry you should run away from. And you certainly don't say, well, that's just a piece of paper. What do I need a piece of paper to validate my love? It's like, your love's that great, is it? You're really that much of a saint that this person, they can just, you say you love them and, oh man, they're just done. They're in bliss. They're in paradise for the rest of their life. They can just rely, you're never going to waver. Now that you expressed your love, you're just going to be there 100% of the time. You don't need anyone else to help you. You don't need a vow. You don't need any tradition. So your love is so pure and holy that other person, they can just rely on you from that second onward. No hesitation. It's like, yeah, right. That's just complete bloody rubbish. You can't even rely on yourself in relationship to yourself for that. So
what I really like about that explanation is this idea that the purpose of marriage is that it's something that keeps you together whenever you want to waver. And I know that this has probably changed a lot because the way that we define marriage on a societal level has changed a lot since it was first invented kind of as an institution. But I do think that there is this, somehow you just feel a little bit more stuck than you would feel otherwise. Even if you're living together, for me, even if we had kids together before getting married, even though our finances were joined again from the moment that we started living together. So even though our lives were already very, very, very entangled with each other, and already trying to separate at that point would have been an intensely painful process for both of us, definitely getting married makes it different. Because, when you get married, traditionally, again, you take on, I say you, in this case, the wife often, traditionally, will take on the husband's name. And somehow the way that you perceive yourself and the way that you perceive each other is that you're much more closely tied together than you were before. To the extent that changing your name changes something about your identity, to the extent that being married is now something that's visible to everyone who knows you because it's in your name, and what that means on like a personal level. Maybe it's not something that everyone needs. And like I said, I really truly believe that we were equally as committed to each other before we got married. And so it's not that it changed something about our commitment to each other. It just made the entanglement that we already felt much more visible and much more obvious, and it strengthened it. It made it so that it would be even more difficult for us to try and detangle ourselves. And then there's a second point that Jordan Peterson makes that I also think is pretty strong here.
And then you might ask, well, why do you need to commit to your partner in front of your community and a higher authority, let's say? And the answer is, well, life is really, really difficult, and you're going to have a rough time with your partner, no matter how much you love them, because the two of you are different, and you're different sexually, and you're different temperamentally, and so you're not going to see eye to eye all the time, and then horribly difficult things are going to come your way, and the complexity of those difficult things is going to tempt you to pull apart. And exactly when pulling apart might be the worst possible thing for you, and maybe you need that vow before your community and God himself, let's say, or at least the state, and the vow that you've made to yourself and your partner, and the vow that you've made publicly to all your friends to keep you together when the going gets rough. And you might say, well, you don't need that. And I would say, well, that's just because the going hasn't got rough enough for you yet, because when it does get that rough, you'll bloody well know that you needed that. That's for sure. And that will definitely happen to you. That will definitely happen to you if you marry someone, because all the things that life can throw at you will be thrown at you in the course of a marriage. One of the things I learned from reading Carl Jung, Jung thought about marriage as a container, as a container for alchemical transformation, as a container that would produce a heat so intense that the base metal of your psyche could be transformed into something ideal. But it had to be a container that could take heat, because it requires heat to transform. And you might say, well, how much heat does someone as base as you need to transform? And the answer might be, a lot of heat. I need a lot of heat and pressure before I'm going to change, before I'm going to become purified in any real sense. And so what's the heat and pressure? Here's what it is. You don't get to run away. You're stuck with that person, and they're stuck with you. And you made a vow. It's like, uh-oh, I'm stuck with you, just like I'm stuck with me. And the vow is exactly that, right? In some real sense, the vow is, I'm going to treat you like you're me, and you don't even like yourself very much. So that's a vicious vow. And so you might say, well, how desperate do you have to be when confronted by someone else to change your ways? And the answer might be, well, you have to be as desperate as being shackled to someone makes you. And if you can walk away, and if you can leave, which you can if you're not bound together, then you're not going to withstand the horrible process of heat and pressure that's required to make you transform. You'll just walk around that. You'll just look for an excuse. I mean, people look for an excuse not to do that anyways. And so part of the reason you get married is so you're desperate enough to change.
I already know that some people will hear that and probably say something along the lines of, are you advocating that people stay in an unhappy marriage? And obviously that's not the point. And maybe this perception of you're stuck together means that you're going to live out the rest of your life in an unhappy marriage. I would argue that that's not the purpose of it. What the purpose behind that argument is to say the moment that you find yourselves unhappy, it should be an opportunity for you to say, how can we fix it? And because you know that you're stuck together, you don't have this out of, okay, you know what, I don't need to be with this person anymore. I can just break up and leave at any point that I want to. That it gives you a little bit more of a motivation, a stronger incentive, if you will, to try and stay together and fix it. And I understand that, again, a lot of people will probably say, okay, but this may have been the case when it wasn't so easy to divorce, when no-fault divorces weren't a thing. And yeah, that is completely a fair point. I totally understand where that's coming from. I would argue that the solution here is to advocate to change the law and not to say, okay, that just to throw out the whole idea of marriage and to completely give up on it. I think the only way that you can avoid being in that situation yourself, to some extent, if you could avoid being in that situation, is to try and get married to someone else who has this same value and the same understanding and the same commitment to the idea of being married, even if it's not a commitment that's forced on them by the state or legally the way that it used to be, or by their church, I guess, the way that it used to be. It's still a commitment that if I, as an individual, really, 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 truly have this and believe in this and hold this as a value, that my partner can trust in that and that I can trust in them to have the same value as well. And obviously that sounds all nice and great in theory, and I understand that it doesn't work that way for a lot of people, and that's a shame. But I think that if you approach marriage from this perspective of there is no out unless something extremely dire happens, like someone dies. There's no alternative except to fix the problems that we experience together and to support each other and to help each other, because otherwise the alternative is I'm going to be unhappy for the rest of my life. We're going to be having this fight for the next 40, 50 years that we will live. And the prospect of that is the thing that you need in order to be actually as deeply committed as you can be to trying to solve the problems that you experience in your life. And maybe that doesn't work for the majority of people. I completely understand that some people just don't have that sense of commitment, but that is what the purpose of marriage is. The purpose of marriage is to say, this is the commitment that you have made to each other. And so if you're going to be making the choice to get married, then that is what you should be believing at the point at which you get married. Now we'll hear a little bit from the whatever guys now.
I just think marriage is an L in today's day and age. I mean, there's obviously the tradition component if you're religious, but when it comes to the government involvement and the potential financial ramifications of having to unwind a marriage, it does not make sense. So don't get married, guys. Don't do it. You do, but you could have a life partner, for example, but you just you don't need the government involved in that.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
And fully want the whole white picket fence, we are husband and wife, but I just don't feel the need to go and sign some paper that lets them know that we are.
Yep.
I believe you lose by getting, married.
What do you lose?
Yeah, what do you lose?
Everything. No. Not everything.
Why? I
but-
hear that so much these days. Everyone I talk to that's married, even people that, even just adults that I meet in my life, they're like, oh, by the way, don't get married. You're young now. I'm going to tell you this, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what do you lose?
Money.
Okay.
Alimony.
That's the only concern.
There's certainly, especially, look, if you're in a 50-50 relationship, even then there can be a contentious divorce, and then you're spending, even if the money isn't going to your partner, there's a dispute, and legal disputes are incredibly expensive. So there's that concern. Obviously, you have to pay the lawyer to, go through the divorce. There's a time period. What do you lose? I mean, you lose the house. You lose half your shit. It depends. Look, alimony is kind of calculated based on how long you've been with the person. So it's not like you've been married for 9 months and you're going to be totally financially wrecked, but it's still going to be an L at the end of the day. So
it's just about money.
Yeah, and not having the government involved in your life, because then you're in the court system. In the court system, there's a anti-male bias in the court system.
I love how he says there's an this whole government also not being involved thing at the end, when it's actually fundamentally about money. And I get it. Honestly, I completely understand. Although I say his argument is fundamentally about money, which I don't even think is the strongest argument. I think the strongest argument is the idea of not only feeling like your belongings are gone, like your money, your wealth, everything that you've worked for let's say 20 years, if you're getting divorced after a 20-year marriage. Like I think that it's much more the emotional weight of that and having to carry that for the rest of your life that is a much, much stronger argument for people against the idea of marriage. And I get it, honestly, obviously the risk of divorce is a really horrible one, and the experience of divorce is a really horrible one. I had a friend who used to be a lawyer. She worked in a family court, and she was so horrified by the experiences and the amount of suffering that people go through when they're in that system, especially when it comes to custody disputes and trying to resolve those, that she was very much one of those people who was like, I would never get married. At the very least, if I were to get married, I would get married with a prenuptial agreement. And I understand having that fear, and I completely get why people who experience that have that so present in their minds. I don't know that there's a solution, to be honest. I think if you ever end up unhappy enough in a marriage that you want to leave it, or unhappy enough in a long-term relationship with your life partner that you still want to leave it, then I would argue that it's still going to be an incredibly painful process to go through. And if you really treat it as though you're really like you're married, in the sense of you combine your finances, you have kids, you manage all your kids together, you live together, all of these things, you buy property together. All of these things are going to be things that make it hard for you to leave no matter what, and that make the experience of divorce horrible no matter what. And yeah, there is, when people say 50% of all marriages end in divorce, so you're taking like a 50-50 shot, I'm like, sure, that is true if you consider yourself just one of the statistics. And everyone will argue, I'm just being realistic about what my real chances are. And yeah, but honestly, I think that even if the chance of a successful marriage is 5%, is 10%, is 20%, I would much rather live the rest of my life with one partner who I can really trust and rely on, and who can really trust me. I would much rather that we build that foundation over years and years and years and years of life together, that it's not just something that we do on a whim, that it's not that I'm with someone for 5 years and then the next person 5 years, or that I'm not with someone for a few months and then I find the next person for 5 months. This idea of like freedom and having all your options open and not being tied to anything feels to me like chaos. Like you're not actually structuring your life in a way that gives you any meaning. You don't have anything that you're putting any hope into. You're not committed to each other. You have no commitments to anyone. And that's not a life of freedom to me. That's a life that's empty of meaning. And so I completely understand that people do not want to take the risk. And that's why I say, the point is not to say you should get married, but is there a purpose to marriage? And I would argue that for people like me who are also not religious, who don't have this whole idea of marriage in the way, that it's wrong to live with someone before you get married or anything. Like I don't have any of these restrictions, these moral restrictions that otherwise a religious authority would place on you. I still believe that it changed our relationship, the number of circumstances that we would have to, like the things that we would have to go through to even consider a divorce, you cannot imagine. And so that's where we are now. You can hear it from Jordan Peterson's own words, which are slightly different to mine.
Love someone, if you fall in love with someone and you decide to marry them, you don't have the evidence at hand that that's the right person for you. What you have instead is the joint decision that come hell or high water, you're going to struggle forward together. And then you don't even know if that's the right decision, because you're not going to know till you've been married, like your whole life. You're not going to have the data. And so you do have to throw yourself into the abyss to be married, just like you have to throw yourself into the abyss to be alive. You have to move forward in faith. And then you might say, well, how do you call the best out of yourself and out of your partner, that may be a partner that you're fortunate enough to love? And the answer might be by offering them the gift of faith, and by saying, look, flawed as we both are, if we commit to each other, we have the possibility of becoming more than we are. And I'd like to do that with you. even though there's no evidence that it's going to work. But then you might think too, the more deeply you're committed to that faith, the more likely it is to work. And you might say, well, why should I be committed? Well, what's the alternative? It's to be uncommitted. Well, are you free then? Or are you just aimless and hopeless and confused? And you admire people who are committed to something. You sort of wish yourself, when you're feeling aimless and you feel that your life is meaningless, you might think, well, I really wish I was committed to something. Wouldn't it be nice to be committed to something? It's like, well, commit to something then. And you say, well, I don't have the evidence. It's like, you don't commit because of the evidence. You commit because of faith. And there's foolish faith, there's naive faith, and there's blind faith. And I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about staking your life on something that might work if you just, if God was willing, if the faith smiled on you and you put your whole soul into it. And that's what you do when you vow to stay faithful to someone. And you can't simulate that. It doesn't work.
If I had to summarize the difference between the two arguments, I would say that maybe Jordan Peterson's argument is on a spiritual level. It's the idea of what do you stand to gain as a human being from getting married, and what do you stand to gain as a couple, actually, not just as an individual, but what does the union between the two of you turn both of you into? So how can it transform you and change your life? Whereas the whatever argument, which I really am sympathetic to, is much more of a materialistic one. It's focused a lot more on the potential risks, on the idea of like a cost-benefit analysis. There are arguments on two completely different levels. And maybe the materialistic one is the one that speaks to you. I would feel, for me personally, that the material, like if I lived my whole life only based on these types of materialistic arguments, if I spent my life only making decisions that I had evidence for, if I really felt like, okay, the only way I could live my life is by being the most rational, evidence-based person that I could be, and that there is no level of belief or faith, but again, from a non-religious standpoint, so faith in my partner, that they will stand by me even when we struggle, then I would really truly believe that my life would just be completely empty, because I just don't think that we function that way as people. And so it's ultimately the question of, are you going to try to pursue something that may not work, that does have some risk associated with it, but that has the potential of completely changing your life in ways that you cannot imagine and making your life so much richer and more meaningful and better? Will you do that? Or are you going to spend the rest of your life kind of chasing a hedonistic way of living and focused only on amassing material wealth, which is great. It's kind of the Andrew Tate model. But that's ultimately not meaningful and doesn't give you the same sense of purpose, that you would otherwise have. And maybe to some extent, this is much more, like, obviously this is coming from me as a woman. And so I don't have this feeling of, alimony payments, or, how are we going to, how would divorce impact us? Like, honestly, I believe that in my marriage, both of us would much rather die before we ever divorced each other. And so the question there is, maybe what we have left over in our current system is we've kind of both diminished the meaning of marriage by changing some of its aspects that were kind of fundamental to the idea of marriage. And one of those is the idea of marriage as a permanent thing, which obviously has been changed for like hundreds of years now. So it's not that that this is new. So the permanence of it is something that we've changed, and the accessibility, like how easy it is to get out of a marriage, is also something that we've changed, while still holding on to laws that were written at a time when, for example, women couldn't work and women weren't the breadwinners and so on. And so the outcome really is that marriage is just much, much, much more risky for men than it is for women. And you can see that now it plays out now on a societal level, where the vast majority of women are still interested in getting married and would still like to get married. But the majority of men have kind of either given up on that or don't see a point in it, or are actively against it and will watch shows like the Whatever podcast, where the host will literally turn to the camera and say, "Don't get married, guys," because it's so risky for them. And that's really sad. And I understand that we live in a time that's really this really sucks for men in very many ways. I would hope that on a societal level and on an individual level, we both somehow still manage to hold on to the idea of marriage enough that we can transform its meaning back to something that is valuable, that really defines how we engage with each other as the kind of the opposite sex, and how truly committed we are to each other and what that means to a couple. And I think that on an individual level, like maybe, I wouldn't choose to get married to any old man across the street. Like that's obviously not the idea. I think that marriage really truly only works if you find a partner who is close enough to you in terms of their values and their belief system that you have a shared foundation that you can build things on top of, and that you commit to each other enough that you actually grow and develop together. That the idea is not is not that you grow apart over time, but actually you grow closer together the longer you've been together. And this has been the case, I'm lucky to say, in my own marriage, and it's something that I just wish for more people, because I think that this is the way that you can have them, like just the maximum joy that is available to you in your life comes very much from being with someone who you know has your back, because you just never by yourself. There is never a challenge and never a problem that you ever have to experience and try to solve on your own. And when you have problems with your health, or when you have problems with your families, or when you have problems with your finances, or when you have problems with your kids, all of these things are so much easier to tackle when you have at least one person there who will always support you through all of it. And this is not something that you can have to the same extent without being married, I believe, anyway. Thank you for listening. Feel free to leave a comment. Like I said, I'm expecting all the people to go, nah, still not into it. Don't really want to get married. And yeah, fair enough. I'm not trying to change your mind. I think you may only change your mind if you meet someone who you think, you know what, I think I could marry this person. But either way, like the video and subscribe for future content. I will see you in the next one.